In May 1945, as the Third Reich lay in ruins, 140,000 German soldiers surrendered from a place most historians have forgotten, a pocket in Latvia where they had been trapped for 7 months in a siege even the Soviets considered pointless. They guarded nothing but Hitler's delusions. This is the story of the Courland Pocket, a place where over 200,000 men fought 6 major Soviet offensives across 7 months. They defended ground that served one man's fantasy about submarines that would never sail. While Berlin burned and Germany collapsed, an entire army group sat trapped on a Latvian peninsula that both sides knew meant nothing. When these soldiers finally surrendered, they emerged from a military time capsule to discover their war had ended 2 days before. Nobody had bothered to tell them because communications had been cut. They were literally in blackout. The jaws of the trap had been closing since summer 1944, and on October 9th, they finally locked shut. The catastrophe began months earlier with Operation Bagration. Launched on June 22, 1944, the Soviet summer offensive achieved something unprecedented on the Eastern Front. It destroyed Army Group Center almost completely by late August. The collapse tore a massive hole in German defenses and exposed Army Group North's southern flank like a wound laid open to infection. What followed was inevitable. Soviet forces of the First Baltic Front drove westward with minimal resistance. They swept through the Baltic states as German units retreated in disarray. On October 9, 1944, Soviet troops reached the Baltic Sea near Memel. They overran the headquarters of the 3rd Panzer Army in the process. That breakthrough severed Army Group North completely from East Prussia and the rest of German forces. The cut was surgical and total. Trapped in western Latvia were approximately 200,000 Wehrmacht and SS troops spread across 33 divisions. Other counts reached as high as 400,000, depending on which source you trust. Alongside them were roughly 14,000 Latvian nationals who had thrown their lot in with the Germans. The entire Courland Peninsula became a cage with water on 3 sides and Soviet armies on the 4th. The troops began digging immediately. Within weeks, the entire pocket was dug up and covered with lines of trenches. Defensive positions multiplied like scar tissue. Bunkers appeared, forward observation posts, artillery positions, machine gun nests. The defensive network grew so dense that one Soviet machine gun platoon commander later recalled, "We would overrun one trench, but then would immediately come across another line of trenches, and it seemed there was no end to them." Schörner's men found themselves trapped, like the doomed 6th Army at Stalingrad 2 years earlier. But rumors circulated that anyone using the word pocket would face Schörner's firing squad. A fanatical Nazi, Schörner punished soldiers severely for the slightest sign of pessimism. The rumors were not taken lightly. So the official term became the Courland Bridgehead, to make it sound as if these trapped men would soon be launching their own offensive. With hundreds of thousands of troops cut off from Germany, the logical military decision was obvious to everyone except the one man whose word was law. In any rational military calculation, the trapped divisions would have been evacuated by sea within weeks, but rationality had long since abandoned Hitler's headquarters. The Baltic Sea offered an escape route. German naval forces still controlled the waters. The port of Liepāja remained in Kriegsmarine hands. The infrastructure existed to evacuate Army Group North the same way German forces would later evacuate hundreds of thousands of civilians and soldiers from East Prussia during Operation Hannibal. The ships were available. The route was open. Every professional military officer who looked at the situation saw the same solution. Hitler saw something else entirely. He categorically refused to authorize evacuation. His decision was not based on military logic, operational necessity, or strategic calculation. It was based on submarines that didn't exist yet. On October 13, 1944, exactly 1 week before Hitler ordered Army Group North to hold Courland, Admiral Dönitz met with the Führer. He stressed the importance of the Baltic for naval training. He promised that the revolutionary-type Visitsvīt U-boats would sail against enemy convoys in January 1945, with 40 Atlantic submarines following in February. These new electro boats could cruise submerged at nearly twice the speed of existing submarines. Their technology was genuinely revolutionary. Dönitz assured Hitler they would sever the link between America and Europe. starving Britain into surrender and forcing the Allies out of Western Europe. This would allow German forces to focus on the Eastern Front, using Courland as a bridgehead for a new offensive. Hitler believed him. The Baltic Sea was essential for submarine training. Courland's ports protected that training ground. So, the men stayed. There was one critical problem with this fantasy. Dönitz knew the boats wouldn't be ready. On October 5th, just 8 days before his meeting with Hitler, Dönitz had privately told the Luftwaffe the new U-boat war wouldn't begin until April 1945 at the earliest. He was attempting to convince Hitler that the revival of the submarine war was just around the corner, when he knew that it was not. Submarine construction fell behind even revised estimates. In early September 1944, the Navy had planned to have 120 Type 26 and 46 to 50 Type 23s by year's end. The actual numbers on January 1st, 1945, 62 Type 26s and 28 Type 23s. Not a single one was operational. By war's end, only 5 or 6 Type 26s ever put to sea. The first launched on January 29, 1945, the last on May 4th. None was sunk while engaged in operations, and Dönitz reported their performance as excellent. But in fact, the biggest problem was that commanders underestimated their own speed. They approached too close to their targets, moving so rapidly that they fired torpedoes within the safety range before the warheads armed. Not a single Type 26 fired a torpedo in combat. The entire strategic justification for keeping 200,000 men trapped in Latvia was a fleet of submarines that would never sail. General Heinz Guderian, the chief of the General Staff, understood what was happening. By January 1945, as the Soviet winter offensive smashed through German lines across the Eastern Front, Germany desperately needed every available division. The defense of the Reich itself hung by a thread. Guderian went to Hitler with a simple request: withdraw Army Group Courland. Bring those divisions back to defend Germany. Hitler refused. Guderian persisted. He argued. He presented the military case. He explained that over 200,000 men sat in Courland, contributing nothing to Germany's defense while Soviet armies drove toward Berlin. In mid-January 1945, Guderian finally extracted a concession. Hitler permitted the withdrawal of 7 divisions from Courland. 7 divisions out of 33. It was a token gesture that condemned the rest. The 4th Panzer Division, the 31st, 32nd, and 93rd Infantry Divisions, the 11th SS Division Nordland, and remnants of several battered units, including the 15th Latvian SS Division, were evacuated over the sea. The remaining 25 or more divisions stayed locked in place. They would remain there as Germany collapsed around them. They would fight through the winter. They would repel Soviet offensives. They would bleed and die for Latvian soil that contributed nothing to the war's outcome. Hitler's personal obstinacy transformed a tactical encirclement into a 7-month death sentence for an entire army group. While Hitler refused to let them leave, the Soviets launched 6 massive offensives that would reveal the true nature of this forgotten front. The first offensive came quickly. On October 15, 1944, just 6 days after the pocket formed, Soviet forces launched their initial attempt to destroy the trapped Germans. The attack was logical. The encirclement was fresh. German defensive positions were incomplete. Schörner had actually planned his own breakout, Operation Geier, for October 17th, using the 4th, 12th, and 14th Panzer Divisions to punch through toward Memel. The Soviets struck first and derailed that plan. The Germans held. The second major offensive rolled forward on October 27th, 1944, and continued through November 25th. 52 Soviet divisions attacked simultaneously. Before dawn, the roaring inferno of 2,000 guns shattered the quiet of the forests. For 1.5 hours, Soviet artillery pounded German positions between the Baltic coast and the River Venta. In the memoir of a German soldier who huddled under the shells, the smaller bunkers rocked like boats on the sea. Treetops slammed down on top of foxholes and trenches. Through the dense artillery, smoke stormed 60 Soviet divisions, if 400 fighting vehicles of the 6th Guards Tank Army supported the infantry in the Skłoda Zwijndode sector alone. The The thinly held German lines cracked almost immediately. "The enemy attacked on a wide front. We are holding," went a radio report from the 215 Fusilier Battalion. Combat conditions were brutal, supplies lacking, and many German soldiers suffered from dysentery. But there was no time for rest. Through icy rain, soaked trenches and bomb craters, dank swamps and forests, attacks and counterattacks swept back and forth. Fighting south of Saldus, the Baden-Württemberger 205th Infantry Division repulsed 6 Soviet divisions. With no reserves left, the division commander, Major General Giese, fed clerks, radio men, medics, and drivers into the front lines. Fortunately for the German soldiers, the Soviet tanks bogged down in a deluge of rain that turned the ground into quagmire. By the end of November, the two sides had again fought themselves to a bloody, exhausted standstill. The Germans held again. The third battle came at Christmas 1944. It earned its own name, the Other Christmas Battle, and what made it uniquely tragic was who fought whom. On December 21st, near Saldus, Soviet forces launched an attack against the German perimeter. The Soviet Second Baltic Front in the northern sector and First Baltic Front in the southern sector commenced what they hoped would be a decisive offensive. But serving with the Second Baltic Front's 22nd Army was the Latvian 130th Rifle Corps. Latvian soldiers who would soon be facing their opposites in the Latvian 19th SS Division. Latvian against Latvian, sometimes brother against brother, Soviet loudspeakers played Latvian folk songs across no man's land. They broadcast entreaties from sisters and fiancés pleading for men to come home. Just like the Greek story about Odysseus, one soldier recalled, it was as much a local war as it was a global conflict. When Latvian units from both sides of the front faced one another directly, they were quite unwilling to fight. They occasionally disengaged without firing a shot. The Soviet command transferred the Latvian divisions elsewhere after a few days. The battle ended on December 31st, and the front was stabilized. The Soviets had gained a few more square kilometers of territory at the expense of tremendous losses in men, tanks, and aircraft. On January 25, 1945, Army Group North was renamed Army Group Courland under Colonel General Lothar Rendulic, while Schörner was transferred to Army Group Center. The renaming acknowledged reality. These forces were not defending northern approaches to Germany. They were trapped in Courland. 3 more offensives followed. On January 23rd, the Soviets launched an offensive trying to break through toward Liepaja and Saldus. They managed to take bridgeheads on the Barda and Vartaja rivers, but were driven off by the Germans. The 5th battle started on February 12th, with a Soviet attack toward Juxta. Other attacks concentrated south of Liepaja, where the Soviets massed 21 divisions, and south of Tukums, where 11 more divisions tried to break through. The 6th and final offensive began in mid-March 1945. The Germans adapted with elastic defensive lines. Forward infantry absorbed initial assaults before withdrawing to prepared positions, allowing panzer reserves and infantry divisions to counterattack and restore the front. By then, the pattern was set. Throughout 7 months of fighting, Soviet forces never advanced more than 25 miles anywhere along the front. They ended no more than a few kilometers forward of their original positions. The terrain of forests and rivers favored the defenders, and the Germans skillfully exploited it. The cost was staggering. The Soviets lost over 1,000 tanks in Courland, according to historian Robert Forzik. A German communique from March 16, 1945, claimed the Soviets had lost 390,000 soldiers, 2,388 tanks, 659 planes, and 900 artillery pieces through the first 5 battles. Soviet records indicate at least 160,948 casualties between February and May 1945 alone, 3,501 irrecoverable losses, and 130,447 medical casualties, covering only the 5th and 6th offensives. German casualties reached approximately 118,000 killed, wounded, and missing, according to historian Karl-Heinz Frieser. Total German casualties were estimated at over 150,000. But something changed in the Soviet approach after the early battles. By December 1944, Soviet command began withdrawing units from Courland to more critical sectors. The Red Army was advancing toward Berlin. They were crushing German resistance in Poland and East Prussia. They were racing toward the Reich itself. Courland became a sideshow. The withdrawal of Soviet units revealed that Soviet command did not consider Courland as important as other sectors of the Eastern Front. Destroying the German forces there was not worth the effort. The goal shifted. Instead of annihilating the pocket, the Soviets simply wanted to prevent German evacuation by sea. The last three offensives were most likely intended merely to keep the Germans contained rather than to destroy them. As late as March 1945, Stalin was still making claims that German forces in Courland would soon be defeated. This victory was necessary, in Stalin's eyes, to re-establish Soviet control over its 1941 frontiers following the annexation of the Baltic states. But the reality on the ground told a different story. Soviet operations were hampered by the difficult terrain and bad weather. The attacking troops simply lacked the strength to make significant progress through forests and swamps that favored defenders at every turn. According to Russian historian Alexei Isayev, Courland was a peripheral front for both the Soviets and Germans. The Soviet goal was to prevent German troops from being transported by sea to reinforce the defense of Berlin. Soviet operations intended to further isolate and destroy the enemy, but the strength of the attacking troops was too low to make any significant progress in the difficult terrain. The Soviet commanders worked competently, and as a result, their casualties remained relatively low compared to other sectors. By the start of April 1945, the Soviets viewed the German forces in Courland as not much more than self-supporting prisoners. Soviet soldiers had their own nickname for the blockaded army group, a camp for armed POWs. The description was devastatingly accurate. These men were prisoners who fed themselves. They were captives who guarded their own perimeter. They were defeated soldiers who had not yet been officially captured. The Soviets left second-line forces to contain the pocket and sent their best divisions west toward Germany. The comparison to Stalingrad is unavoidable. Stalingrad remains World War II's most famous siege, the battle that turned the tide on the Eastern Front, the graveyard of the German Sixth Army. Every history of the war dedicates chapters to Stalingrad. The siege lasted from August 1942 to February 1943. 5 months of brutal urban combat that ended with the surrender of 91,000 German soldiers. The Courland Pocket endured for 7 full months, from October 9, 1944 to May 10, 1945. 7 months of continuous encirclement, 7 months of defensive warfare, 7 months of Soviet offensives and German counterattacks. But unlike Stalingrad, which held genuine strategic importance, Courland was recognized as worthless by both sides. Stalingrad mattered. The city controlled access to the Volga River and the route to Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. Its capture would have severed a critical Soviet supply line. Both Hitler and Stalin understood the city's significance. They poured resources into the battle because the outcome mattered. When the German Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad, it represented a genuine strategic defeat that shifted the war's momentum. Courland mattered to no one except Hitler and his submarine fantasies. The peninsula controlled no critical resources. It blocked no important routes. It threatened no vital Soviet positions. Its capture or retention changed nothing about the war's trajectory. The siege outlasted the fall of Berlin. It outlasted Hitler's death. It outlasted the collapse of the Third Reich itself. When Soviet forces finally took Berlin on May 2, 1945, the Germans in Courland were still holding their defensive positions. When Hitler killed himself in his bunker on April 30th, the men in Courland were still repelling Soviet probes. When Germany signed its unconditional surrender on May 8th, soldiers in Courland were still manning their trenches. For 7 months, over 200,000 men existed in a strategic time capsule. They fought a war that had already been decided elsewhere. They defended territory that both sides knew was militarily irrelevant. They maintained unit cohesion and fighting capability in service of nothing. The Eastern Front's decisive actions were happening hundreds of miles away. Berlin was falling. The Reich was dying. The war was ending. But in Courland, the fighting continued. The Germans dug their trenches deeper. The Soviets probed their lines. Men died in those trenches defending and attacking ground that mattered to no one. They bled for villages whose names would never appear in history books. They fought battles that changed nothing about the war's outcome. When the end finally came to Courland, it arrived not with thunder, but with paperwork. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The Reich that had dominated Europe ceased to exist. The government that had commanded these soldiers dissolved. The state they served was legally extinct, but the men in Courland were still at their posts. They still manned their defensive positions. The pocket was in communications blackout. They did not receive their orders until May 10th, 2 days after the war had ended. Army Group Courland became one of the last German formations to surrender in Europe. The Germans were the first to let us know that the war was over, recalled Soviet Marine infantryman Pavel Klimov about the events of May 9, 1945. We were proceeding along the shore and couldn't understand the commotion and jubilation along the German trenches. It turned out that they had learned that the war had ended. We learned from the fireworks and the firing in the air that it was over. Only then did we receive an order by radio to abort the operation. There was a lot of joy. On May 9th, General Ivan Bagramyan accepted the surrender of German forces at Izere Manor in southwest Latvia. Colonel General Karl Hilpert, the Army Group's last commander, surrendered himself, his personal staff, and the staffs of 3 armies to Marshal Leonid Govarov, commander of the Leningrad Front. At this time, the group still consisted of the remnants of 27 divisions and 1 brigade. General Otto Friedrich Rauser succeeded in negotiating slightly better surrender terms from the Soviets. Between May 9 and May 12, 1945, approximately 140,108 men and non-commissioned officers formally surrendered in Courland. Along with them, 5,083 officers and 28 generals, an entire army's command structure trapped by Hitler's refusal to evacuate. These were not junior officers or company commanders. These were the men who led divisions and corps, the senior leadership of a major German army group, all of them trapped in Courland for 7 months because one man believed in submarines that would never sail. Among those 42 generals in the broader Baltic surrender was Hilpert himself. He would be tried by the Soviets for war crimes and executed in 1947. The surrender came not from military defeat, but from the legal extinction of the state they served. The Germans in Courland had not been overrun. Their defensive positions remained intact. Their units maintained cohesion. They still possessed functional combat capability, but they had no country to fight for anymore, no government to issue orders. So, they surrendered. The inventory of captured equipment reads like a catalog of what might have been. An entire army's arsenal locked away while Germany burned. 75 aircraft sat on Courland airfields. 307 tanks and self-propelled guns filled motor pools. 1,427 artillery pieces occupied firing positions. 557 mortars. 3,879 machine guns. 52,887 rifles and submachine guns. 219 armored personnel carriers. 310 radio stations. 4,281 motor vehicles, 240 tractors, 3,442 carts loaded with military cargoes, 14,056 horses. This was not the equipment of a defeated army. This was a fully functional military force. They had maintained their arsenal through 7 months of encirclement. They had preserved their combat capability even as Germany collapsed around them, and it had all sat unused while Germany desperately needed it elsewhere. By May 23rd, the Soviet roundup of German troops was completed. A total of about 180,000 German troops were taken into captivity from the Baltic area. Captive officers were turned over to the NKVD. The bulk of the captives were taken to camps in the Valdai Hills. After the surrender, some elements of Army Group Courland briefly attempted to reform as a Freikorps. This was reminiscent of similar actions taken at the end of World War I, but atypical for the end of World War II. The Soviets immediately prevented this. They were obviously unwilling to allow such an action by a beaten foe. In addition, the Soviets did not intend for Germans to remain settled in the Courland area after the war. But for many Latvians, the war didn't end in May 1945. Approximately 4,000 Latvian soldiers evaded Soviet capture. They went to the forests and formed partisan organizations to continue their fight against the Soviets and to gain independence for Soviet-occupied Latvia. These forest brothers operated in the Baltic region until the early 1950s. The Soviets responded with widespread deforestation campaigns, burning tracts of forest to flush out resistors. They detained all males between the ages of 16 and 60 in Latvia. Soldiers of the Latvian Legion, who surrendered along with the Germans or were captured, were treated as traitors under the pretext that Latvia was part of the Soviet Union, and many were summarily executed. Almost 50,000 Latvian soldiers became Soviet prisoners of war in filtration or gulag camps. The surviving German POWs faced their own ordeal. For those captured at war's end, survival rates were higher than for earlier prisoners, but they remained in captivity for years. The last German prisoners didn't return from the USSR until 1956, 11 years after the war ended. According to one account, the majority of the approximately 203,000 troops of Army Group Courland who entered Soviet prison camps never returned to Germany. Today, approximately 80,000 soldiers still lie undiscovered in Latvia. The Saldus German Soldiers Cemetery covers 8 hectares and contains the remains of around 25,000 German soldiers and Latvian legionnaires, with reburials ongoing since 1997. The entire population of the Zvarde parish was evicted after the war, and the area became a Soviet air bombardment training ground until 1990. After the Soviet military left Latvia in 1994, archaeologists finally gained access to a landscape barely trodden by human feet since 1945. They found overgrown trenches stretching through dark forests, forgotten bunkers half buried in swamps, and the bones of men who died for ground that never mattered. To command Army Group Courland was to preside over a military absurdity, an entire army fighting for nothing, going nowhere. Feldmarschall Ferdinand Schörner commanded Army Group North when the pocket formed. Schörner was Hitler's kind of general, fanatical, ruthless, and willing to execute orders without question. When Hitler demanded that Army Group North hold its position despite encirclement, Schörner made it happen. He organized the defense. He positioned the divisions. He prepared to fight the Soviets for as long as Hitler demanded. Then, in January 1945, Schörner escaped. Hitler transferred him to command Army Group Center. It was technically a promotion. Army Group Center faced the main Soviet thrust toward Germany. It was a more important command, a more critical sector, a place where German resistance might actually matter. Schörner left Courland behind and took up his new position defending approaches to the Reich itself. The timing was convenient. Schörner commanded the pocket during its formation and initial defense. He oversaw the first brutal months of encirclement. Then he departed just as the situation's ultimate futility became undeniable. Whether this was calculated career management or simple military necessity, the effect was the same. Schörner got out. Colonel General Lothar Rendulic took his place on January 25, 1945. He inherited a command that was already a strategic dead end. By January 1945, Germany's military situation had deteriorated catastrophically. The Soviet winter offensive was smashing through German lines across the Eastern Front. East Prussia was being overrun. Poland was lost. The Red Army was approaching German soil. Every available division was desperately needed to defend the Reich. Except for the divisions in Courland, Rendulic presided over the pocket's final months as it devolved from active front to strategic irrelevance. He commanded forces that both sides knew were functionally defeated. The Germans could not break out. The Soviets would not bother destroying them. The entire military situation existed in a state of suspended animation. Rendulic's job was not to win anything or accomplish any objective. His job was to maintain discipline and defensive positions until the war ended. Both Schörner and Rendulic were trapped between military reality and Hitler's ideological imperatives. They were professional officers executing an irrational strategy. They commanded divisions that should have been evacuated months earlier. They organized defenses of territory that served no purpose. From a purely tactical perspective, Army Group Courland performed admirably. The trapped divisions never collapsed. They never broke. They held their positions through 6 major offensives across 7 months. But tactical competence cannot redeem strategic insanity. The Courland Pocket endured for 7 months, not because it mattered strategically, but because Hitler believed in wonder weapons that would never work. Dönitz knew the Type Submarine boats weren't ready. He told Hitler they would sail in January, knowing they couldn't sail until April at the earliest. And even that was optimistic. By the time Germany surrendered, only 118 Type Submarines had been completed out of 1,170 planned. He asked Hitler to sacrifice army units to protect training grounds for a fleet that would never be operational. If Dönitz genuinely believed a handful of submarines could force the Western Allies out of the war, he was as divorced from reality as Hitler. The men trapped in Courland paid the price for that fantasy. This forgotten chapter of World War II stands as testimony to how encirclement warfare combined with irrational leadership can transform soldiers into living ghosts. The men in Courland performed their duties with discipline and courage. They maintained combat effectiveness through 7 months of siege. They repelled 6 major offensives. They never broke or collapsed. From a tactical perspective, they did everything right. But tactics cannot redeem strategic insanity. While these soldiers held their positions in Latvia, the war they were fighting ended elsewhere. Berlin fell, Hitler died, Germany surrendered, the Third Reich collapsed. And through it all, the men in Courland remained at their posts because communications were cut and the blackout was total. When those 140,000 men finally surrendered between May 9th and May 12th, 1945, they emerged from a 7-month time capsule. They discovered their war had ended days before. They learned that their sacrifice had contributed nothing to Germany's defense. They realized they had been fighting and dying for a strategic irrelevance while the decisive battles happened hundreds of miles away. The Courland Pocket's true significance lies not in the battles fought there, but in what those battles represented. This was military effort divorced from strategic purpose. This was sacrifice without meaning. This was courage and discipline and professional competence employed in service of nothing. The Pocket stands as a monument to the human cost of fantasy overriding military rationality. Hitler kept these men trapped because abandoning Courland would have required admitting that his submarine dream was dead. It would have required acknowledging that Germany was losing. So the men stayed, they fought, they died, and their sacrifice changed nothing. The inventory of captured equipment tells us what Germany lost materially: 75 aircraft, 307 tanks, 14,000 horses, an entire army's worth of equipment that sat unused while Germany burned. But the deeper loss cannot be inventoried. It was the waste of human potential, the squandering of courage and sacrifice, the transformation of professional soldiers into a camp for armed POWs. The Courland Pocket deserves to be remembered, not as a heroic last stand, but as a cautionary tale. It reveals what happens when fantasy trumps reason, when symbolic gestures replace strategic thinking, when one man's refusal to face reality condemns hundreds of thousands to futility. These soldiers deserve better than to be forgotten. They deserve better than to fight a pointless battle while their country collapsed. They deserved leadership that valued their lives more than submarines that would never sail. Instead, they got 7 months in a forgotten pocket, fighting battles that did not matter, defending ground that served no purpose, sacrificing themselves for nothing, while history moved on without them. That is the legacy of Courland, not heroism or tragedy in the classical sense, but waste, pure, strategic, fantasy-driven waste. When we forget Courland, we forget one of the war's clearest lessons. That courage and discipline cannot compensate for irrational leadership. That tactical competence means nothing without strategic purpose. That soldiers deserve commanders who value their lives more than their delusions. The 140,000 men who surrendered in May 1945 paid the price for forgetting those lessons. The 80,000 bodies still lying undiscovered in Latvian forests are the monument to that price. We dishonor their sacrifice if we forget them again. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.